Welcome to episode 108 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share 4 teaching mistakes that drained my energy and the solutions that changed everything. Visit truthforteachers.com to get a transcript of this episode or to share your thoughts in the comments. So I shared in my book, Unshakeable, 20 Ways to Enjoy Teaching Every Day, No Matter What. I talked a lot about the importance of saving energy and thinking about what gives you energy and what drains your energy. And that's because energy is one of our most precious resources. Unlike time, energy doesn't naturally replenish itself. We have to be really intentional about how we use our energy. And if we don't pay attention to the things that drain it and do less of those things, and pay attention to the things that are energy giving and do more of those things, we're going to find ourselves feeling depleted all the time. So today I'm going to share with you 4 habits and practices that drained my energy as a teacher for years. And I'll share the solutions that I uncovered that completely transformed the way I approach my work. The first mistake that I made that drained my energy was talking nonstop. I ran my mouth so much as a rookie teacher that I lost my voice every fall for the first 5 years I was in the classroom. I would explain, re-explain, explain again in different words, and then recap with yet another explanation. The only time I would stop talking was to give the evil eye or to give that deadly silence to students who dared to steal my thunder by saying something themselves. In retrospect, I think I felt like my talking was the glue that held the classroom together. I think I worried that without my constant narration of everything that was happening, somehow the momentum of student learning would wane. I didn't feel like I could just give a direction and let students follow it. I had to praise the students who were on task. I had to redirect the ones who were off task. I had to fill every moment of a transition with my voice so that students wouldn't fill it with their own talking. If we had a class discussion, I'd feel the need to repeat and affirm everything the kids said to make sure that everyone else heard it and was learning from it, instead of just letting students' words stand on their own. It was as if I thought kids couldn't learn from one another unless I was there to repeat it back more loudly and to word things with a larger vocabulary and use greater precision in the way that I spoke about the topic. Really, it was just all too much. It was just too much talking, too much information for kids, too much effort on my part that left the kids with no role to play other than just quiet passivity. With all the energy that I expended prattling on and on, I probably would have collapsed in a heap by 3 p.m. every day if I hadn't been 22 years old and had a 22-year-old's energy level. I'm amazed, honestly, that my kids internalized anything that I taught, considering how much filtering out they had to do while listening, and how few opportunities they had to ever discuss or process their learning. The solution I discovered was to sit with the discomfort and to give kids the opportunity to talk more. I'm not sure if I would have ever changed in this area if I hadn't been ending every single day utterly exhausted and with a sore throat. I wasn't sure what to do differently at first. So I just started experimenting. I spent less time standing at the front of the classroom, for example. It's easy to get in an instructional rut when you stand at the same place near the board all day long. So I'd occasionally sit on the side of the classroom or sit in an absent student's desk and say, okay, I need someone to go up and demonstrate blank for us. It was so nice to sit and say nothing that I then tried staying there, sitting among the class once the student was done demonstrating and asking follow-up questions from other students from there instead of commenting on the student's demo myself. So I would sit there and say things like, what do you all think? Is that an effective method? How do you know? Does anyone else use a different strategy? And try to continue that conversation so the kids were talking and leading the discussion rather than me. I also forced myself to get comfortable with think time, and I pushed against that feeling that I would lose students' attention if I didn't jump in with follow-up questions, because I knew that providing wait time can actually increase the length and the quality of their responses. Additionally, I looked for ways to turn my summaries and my narrations into questions that would prompt students to think. So instead of saying to a group, "Nice work over here, I like that strategy you used," I'd ask the kids to reflect on their own work. So I'd say, tell me how your group has chosen to solve the problem. Or instead of telling a kid, take a look at number 3, that answer is incorrect, I'd say, would you tell me how you got the answer for number 3? And sort of see if the student could uncover the mistake, him or herself. Slowly over time, I began guiding more than directing and facilitating instead of just instructing. When I started discovering active learning techniques, it felt like the heavens had opened up and the angels were singing. Finally, I had a different approach to teaching that would keep students engaged and make sure they were learning without doing all the work myself. And they were actually learning more than when I was in charge. I could walk quietly around the classroom as students talked to one another and listen in on conversations instead of lecturing. I know that if I hadn't changed the way I taught and shifted my perception of the teacher's role in the classroom so that it was no longer necessary for me to talk constantly, I would have almost certainly burned myself out. So that's the first teaching mistake I made that drained my energy, just talking nonstop. The second teaching mistake that I made was not really making time to enjoy my students. I'm an introvert and I'm a serious person by nature, so my definition of having fun just isn't the same as a lot of other people's definition. I had a hard time being fully present with kids and really enjoying them because I was simultaneously focused on trying to manage the classroom and keep the noise level down and make sure the whole show was running smoothly. So during center time, a child would be telling me about something incredible that she learned, and her face would be all lit up with delight, and she's looking up at me, and I just wasn't really focused on her. I would smile and nod, but I'd be looking out of the corner of my eye to make sure that all the kids in the rest of the centers were still on task while I was giving her my attention. And interestingly, I really felt like this was the right thing to do. I learned in college about withedness, that ability of a teacher to be aware of everything that's going on in the classroom. And I thought that that was somehow more important than connecting with kids. When a student was experiencing that light bulb moment that teachers just live for, I felt like I couldn't fully take in the joy of having all that hard work pay off because I would be annoyed that on the other side of the room, one of the kids was flicking pencil shavings at another child or doing something else off task. I felt like I couldn't fully enjoy my students unless everyone was on task and the whole classroom was running smoothly. And so I was constantly slipping in and out of this state of presence, and one child misbehaving had the power to throw me off. The solution that I uncovered was to be present and to actively look for small moments to enjoy the kids more. My thinking about this and my discovery of the solution changed on the last day of school during my 4th year of teaching. So the kids were playing this game of 4 corners, and they were begging me to play along with them. Normally, I felt like I couldn't possibly join in. I needed to make sure that no one was cheating. I needed to make sure no one was running around the room. I had to make sure everyone was following the rules of the game appropriately. But since it was the last day of school, I figured, okay, what the heck, I'll join in. I had so much fun that day. I remember that game like it was yesterday. It's so vivid in my memory. And that changed the way I taught forever. Giving up control was a long, slow process for me. Don't think that that happened overnight. But I never forgot how it felt to learn and play with my students. And the memory of that fueled my motivation to keep improving, and it became my goal moving forward. I'd always known that this was a weakness of mine, but it wasn't until that day that I really saw the power of what it felt like to be able to experience that enjoyment of my students, and that really motivated me to do better. I realized that even though I had a lot on my plate as a teacher, I didn't need to weigh my students down with that burden of responsibility all the time. I had to practice being in the present moment and actively looking for those moments to enjoy and appreciate my kids for who they were as individuals. This became easier and easier over time until it actually became my second nature. It was an intentional shift that I made with practice. So my first teaching mistake that drained my energy was talking nonstop. My second one was not being present with the kids and taking time to really enjoy them. A third teaching mistake that I made was giving way too much homework and being a tyrant about collecting it. Like a lot of the other issues here, this was a product of my controlling nature, coupled with the school culture and the norms of the time. So in the early 2000s, my 3rd grade team, on a nightly basis, gave students a half hour of reading, plus math practice, plus spelling practice, and usually an assignment from another subject too, along with any classwork that they hadn't finished that day. I have no doubt that many of my 8-year-old students spent 90 minutes or more a night completing these assignments. It just makes me sick now thinking back. That's one of the main things that I would love to redo from my early years as a teacher. And to make matters worse, I yelled at my students and I guilt tripped them when they didn't turn their work in. I acted like it was just the end of the world if they didn't write those spelling words 5 times each, as if that assignment had any bearing at all on how they spelled their words in their actual writing later on. I spent way too much time and energy tracking who was going to miss recess because of their missing assignments. And I'm pretty sure at some point I also displayed that information on the board for the whole class to see. Another big cringeworthy memory. Homework for me was a painful process. It was a huge headache, and it was a massive source of stress. And that meant I made it a massive source of stress for my students and probably their parents too. The solution that I came to over time was to give less homework, to collect it weekly, and to stop acting like it was the end of the world when students didn't turn it in. I transferred to another school district where this sort of homework load wasn't the norm, and kids were spending about 30 minutes a night on homework. That really opened my eyes to the fact that just because something had always been done, in my experience and in the school I was teaching in, did not mean that that was the universal approach or the right approach. And interestingly, I found that the reduced homework load didn't make a huge difference in my stress level. And it also didn't increase the completion level for kids. I thought for sure, well, if they only have 30 minutes a night, most of them will do it, right? It won't be that big of a deal for me to assign it and collect it. It was really no different. There were still multiple kids who didn't finish the work each night, and it raised my blood pressure every time I had to deal with it. But the seed had now been planted for me to think about this problem differently. I began looking for homework research to justify reducing the requirements, and I discovered Kathy Vanderot's excellent book, Rethinking Homework. I realized that the connection between homework and student achievement is tenuous at best, particularly at the elementary level. I not only eased up on the amount of assignments, giving the absolute minimum required by the district, but I also started collecting everything once a week so that students had a longer opportunity to get it done. This was the biggest game changer for me in terms of ensuring that homework was no longer a daily battle and energy drain. It became something that I only had to think about on Fridays, when the old homework was collected and new assignments were given. Homework completion rates soared once kids and families had a full 7 days to find time in their schedule for it. I also removed punishments for not doing homework. Now, this was not my choice, to be honest. It was simply because of new physical activity regulations in my state had been put into place, and we were no longer allowed to take away recess for kids who didn't do homework, or for any reason. Many of my colleagues implemented other consequences for missing homework, but I decided, take a risk, let's do an experiment. And I had no consequences at all for kids who didn't turn in their homework. And to my surprise, the majority of the class continued to turn it in on a regular basis. The only kids who didn't turn it in were the ones who didn't turn it in even when there was a consequence. It wasn't the threat of missing recess that motivated the other kids to get it done. And those who didn't do the work needed more support and structure because no amount of punishment or consequences was going to make a difference for them. It took a good, probably 2 full school years of experimentation for me to find a system I was comfortable with, but I didn't give up until I figured out a way to remove the stress of homework for me, my students, and their families. Collecting it on a weekly basis and not punishing kids for a lack of homework really made a big difference. A final teaching mistake that I made that really drained my energy was that I spent hours looking for lesson ideas, and I tried to cram too many things into our day. So a lot of my lesson planning process was focused on activities. What will the kids do today? And I felt like the best way to plan those activities was to look at every possible option and then decide which one I wanted to use. The problem with this from an energy standpoint is that exploring all the possible options became more and more time-consuming every year. In the beginning of my teaching career, I had only a few teacher resource books to choose from. But after a brief eBay addiction in which I would buy used teacher resource books, photocopy what I needed, and then resell them on eBay to get money for more teacher resource books, let's just say I had a lot of books and papers to go through. And of course, every year there were more and more activities and printables available online too. So it would take hours to feel like I'd even scratched the surface of seeing all the different ways that I could teach a skill. I would finally close my laptop and I'd look at that pile of random printouts and sticky notes that I'd scrawled on and just think, but now what? How did I just spend 3 hours on lesson planning and I still have no idea what I'm doing for this unit? Because I was exhausted at this point, I'd pick a handful of things that looked the easiest and just add them to my lesson plans. That's not exactly the mark of a solid lesson, right? And plus, the temptation to choose too many activities was strong. I'd uncovered so many possibilities that it absolutely crushed me to leave things out. I wanted my kids to be able to do all of those awesome activities that I discovered. I felt that I had to include this one particular activity because I knew the kids would really like it. And I had to include this other activity because the principal would really like that one. A third activity would make it into the unit because all my coworkers did it. And another activity would make it in because I'd done it every single year and I was really sentimental about the lesson. Other activities I felt compelled to include because I'd paid for the resource and didn't want my money to be wasted. And others I included because I'd spent a whole weekend designing something from scratch and I didn't want my time to be wasted. I was weighed down by this constant burden to do more, fit more in, cram every last second of the day with a meaningful learning opportunity. And I pushed that burden onto students so that everyone felt rushed all day long. The solution that I uncovered was to focus on outcomes, not activities, and do fewer things better. When I first heard about UBD, Understanding by Design, I knew immediately that backwards planning was the solution for me. I spent one summer studying the UBD book and practicing with the templates for a single subject area. I picked the one that I liked the least and that I had the hardest time planning for, which was science. And I mapped out UBD units for the entire year for my science program. Now, because I was never formally trained in Understanding by Design, I'm certain that I wasn't following this process with fidelity, but I'd learned enough to completely shift my mindset around planning. I was amazed at how beginning with the end in mind, deciding what kids needed to do and what they needed to be able to do at an end of the unit, start there, and what standards they needed to meet, really just simplified everything else. It immediately became clear when I was planning if kids needed to do XYZ by the end of the month, then I'd have just 1 week for each skill leading up to that outcome. I'd then think about what aspect of that skill to teach each day during the week. And that was relatively simple to do because the lessons were generally cumulative. Once I knew the target outcome for the day, I no longer felt any need to look through tons of activities. I would realize, okay, I've only got 45 minutes to get kids where they need to be. There's no reason to look for fun worksheets or cute projects. I'd ask myself, what's the most impactful way I can help get kids to this target? And all the distractions would fade away. This streamlined approach made me realize that a lot of the most effective ways for me to teach and most effective ways for kids to practice were just too good to be used only once a year. When I think about the most impactful teaching strategy, I'd remember something from the previous unit when the kids had really been successful with a specific activity, and I'd want to use it again. Over time, I developed a repertoire of go-to teaching activities that were versatile and open-ended and could be plugged into just about any unit I taught. I no longer had to spend hours hunting online for just the right activity to teach a topic because I already had a few dozen learning strategies that the kids knew and loved. I could just look at my list of activities, pick that one that would work, and pencil it into my lesson plans. Eventually, I took the time to make my teacher bag of tricks understandable and accessible to other teachers by writing out each step of the different activities and organizing them according to the level of prep needed and difficulty and so on. So if you want to learn more about this, tap the link in the show notes. So in your podcast player app, whatever app you're using to listen to this, you should be able to tap on this episode to see more info about it. And if you do that, you'll find the episode summary and the link to the box of tricks, which is in my Teachers Pay Teachers store. So those are the 4 teaching mistakes that drained my energy and the solutions that changed everything. To recap, I talked nonstop. And the solution was to sit with the discomfort of silence and give the kids opportunities to talk more. I didn't take time to really enjoy my students. And the solution was to be present and actively look for small moments to enjoy the kids more. The third mistake was giving too much homework and being a tyrant about collecting it. And my solution was to give less homework, collect it weekly, and stop acting like it was the end of the world when students didn't turn it in. And finally, I spent hours looking for lesson ideas and trying to cram too many things into our day. And the solution was to focus on outcomes, not activities, and do fewer things better. Your takeaway truth for the week ahead is this: your daily habits either give you energy or drain it from you. Choose wisely. Have a fantastic week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.